Okay, quick recap. So major project system. First thing we're going to be doing here is reading in the capital stock at the top here. So we've called everything MP in these major project variables. So we are reading in the major project capital stock through these ones with the various industries that you can select from in the project system. The next component is the cumulative project capital. And we have to accumulate this stock because we are subtracting it from the model investment equations. So here in the case of the agriculture investment, because we're applying depreciation rates and so forth and other expected sales adjustment factors, these are really intended to only apply to the capital stock, excluding the projects. And because we have projects completing and at all different times, you can have projects lasting a decade, a project lasting a year. So they turn on at different times. Therefore, you need to account for that accumulation in the capital stock that's generated from a multitude of projects. And therefore, it is summed up for that reason. So after the cumulative base stock components, we read in the investment. So IMP in this case. And again, you'll see all the same type of industries for the investment. Now we differentiate the variables in the project system. We actually call them ITs, which is meant to imply investment total for the projects. So that helps when you have your project database open in Forecast here, for example, because I don't have to put a concatenation on to make sure I'm pulling that. For example, if we called them IMP ag, I would need that because otherwise it would be looking at the values in the forecast database. When you are viewing variables in this system, the way the forecast gear works, it will go in the order that databases appear in. So if there is an IMP ag in both of these databases, you're only going to see the one in that base, in the first base that occurs, right? So that's why we deal with concatenation statements in general here. So it's all about controlling, making sure you're pulling it from the right database. And given that the project system has investment, some of these projects, we're still modeling them back in history during the known fixed capital stocks and flows data years. We only read in from for the forecast period and on. And that goes back to that component where I showed you, in the utilities sector, for example, ITU TMN versus IMP UTMN. So where we had the kiosk dam operating for different years. So here you can see the project version, which includes all that historical investment, whereas the one in the model is only reading it in from 19 and on, right? So that's sort of what you have to worry about here when you're looking at this stuff. So that's why we called it IT, just so it's differentiated from the IMP, and then you can view it quite quickly that way, so long as you have your major project space open. So we read these in. We then do some special aggregations again on some of the subsectors, PST and the ASW sector, the other private services, information, culture, and recreation. So the other primary, we call it an oil and gas. So that's essentially all other mining and the support activities included in there. It's just getting them synced up to use with our two-digit industry investment equations in the model, of course. The next thing that's important here is, so you remember me talking about asset class shares in the project system, where we have engineering and building and machinery and equipment. In our project system, we assume there is zero intellectual property. So we're not trying to model research or technology projects, software creation. That's not what we're trying to do here. This is about more physical, tangible capital developments that we use the system for. So the point is your engineering, building, and M&E shares would sum to 1 is the idea. There would be zero intellectual property in this case. So what we get here, and the reason we have to do that is we want to know how much of the investment is going to be in construction. right? So obviously the construction investment is engineering and buildings. We do not want the machinery and equipment in there. So this non-resident INRCMP, we call it, non-residential construction major projects, that is reading in a summation of every single project's engineering and building component, right? Because we want this as a driver for the construction industry. So all we're focused on are those asset classes in engineering construction and building construction in this case. So that's what these are. That's what the ICN represents, and you can see that when we look at the macro, the project macro that's created, right? I'll go through that next. So that's all this is. So we read in that construction component, and of course that would go right into the construction equations and through the construction industry, of course. And expected sales growth, same type of concept. You're trying to isolate that, and there you go. So that's what we're up to here. Okay, we also like to sum them all. We have to do this because we have those asset class components at the top of the model on the demand side. So same type of concept. This is really just a summation of all the engineering construction for every sector, all projects. And then we also we like to isolate the education, health, and government services because if you noticed, we segregate our engineering construction into commercial, institutional, and industrial stuff. So this represents the institutional and government side, and their EC, investment in engineering construction for education, health, and public admin in that case. An exact same concept for the building construction. So we're trying to build out that institutional and government piece of buildings. And so you're going to see, obviously, all the hospitals and schools are going to get in, whereas the public administration tends to focus more on the engineering side of things. So you'll have a much larger value in that number because it includes things like road work, highways, bridges, all your transportation infrastructure that the government spends on. That's all classified as engineering spending. Whereas, hospitals and schools obviously get a significantly higher proportion in buildings. And then obviously here we're just summing up the components. So I stands for industrial, and these are the industries that we include in industrial. So agriculture, other primary manufacturing, transportation, warehousing, and utilities. And then we also have the commercial sector that we define by trade, the wholesale and retail trade, the finance, insurance, and real estate, professional, scientific, technical, again, the management and stuff, accommodation, food, other private services, and the ICR, information, culture, and recreation. So that's all this is doing. It's about definitions on these what we call ICI components: industrial, commercial, and institutional. Okay, next thing we're doing here. So we're just these are all just read-in functions. You're never going to have to touch any of this stuff. It's just set it up here to really pull all this information in and get it in the right place for the model. We then read in all of our operational employment. So here we call them EMP. So that will give you your operational employment. And you can see on the right-hand side, we're reading in a variable called EO from the project system. The O obviously representing operational employment. So this is once these facilities that we build in the major project system start producing after the construction phase, that's when your operational jobs will kick in. And that's how the system works. But as well, we have a construction component developed in here as well. So within, if I go back to the project spreadsheet, you may have noticed that we have two categories. We are not only trying to account for the number of construction workers that are going to be needed to build these things, we also want to know how many people are going to be operating them. So there's two methods here of doing this. I'll get into this next, once we start looking at that sheet and the macro that it develops. Finally, we are reading in the exports and the imports that are produced by these projects. So you can make assumptions about is is this new food plant going to be exporting everything outside of the province? If so, you can actually control for the export and import shares, or is it going to be offsetting imports currently that the province is bringing in, right? If we start building a new French fry plant, were you getting all your French fries from Nova Scotia before now, and now you have a French fry factory that you don't need to import them, of course, anymore. So you can make assumptions about this type of stuff. It really just hits the trade equations or the trade tables more so, but it isn't important for gross output because gross output is production times quantity. Therefore, those positive exports you would gain plus those negative imports, or minus the negative imports, you could say, that is your gross output. So it's really just an allocation concept to try to control for trade offsets when you build these projects, when you implement these projects into the system. And then finally, we're just reading in the gross output components. So this is exactly what I was talking about, right? You're taking the exports plus the imports. That's your gross output by definition, whether it increases exports 100% or it does some combination of exports versus imports. That's where you're dealing with that. And then again, there's the GDP piece as well. And then the bottom here, all we do, we're adding them up. So we have a lot of detail on the GDP side that comes out of the project system. And the reason we do that is so that we can get more, use more productivity information for the smaller sectors, right? Because you don't want to apply other primary productivity to a gold mine, or you don't want to get oil and gas blended in there, screwing up your productivity numbers, right? So that's what this is really about. We try to get the GDP disaggregated quite a bit here, particularly the manufacturing sector, right? So we're dealing with, productivity for all these subsectors. And that way you can, for example, you guys want to put in a new pharmaceutical plant, you should get better representation on the GDP estimate if you are using that employment method, multiplying the operation jobs times pharmaceutical productivity or other chemical sector productivity. So that's all this is doing, and that is the end of the macro. So we may as well move in to this spreadsheet now and talk about the project system a little bit. So what we have here, I hope all these headers are correct. We've been constantly changing the system, but you can hover over the top box cell here, and it typically gives you your choices. Now, one component we have to actually fix this is for the manufacturing industry, because we've blown that out quite a bit here. Also, as you can see, the ICR piece isn't in there, so we have to fix this header for you. And I will make a note of that. The concept is, once we do fix that for you, it gives you come in here and you say, okay, look, my boss has asked me to add this project, see what the impact of putting it into the system is. Which sector do I allocate it to first off? So you're going to need your familiarity with your NAICS for that purpose, obviously. But by hovering over this, you would have a choice of all the industry mnemonics that you could enter in this column, right? So in this case, this is a non-oil and gas project in the other primary sector, so we put it in as OOP, that other primary, we call it. In the utilities, we're not dealing with electric power versus other, so it just, your only choice here is the utility sector as a whole. So these will these mnemonics will generate those K and those I, the KMPs and the IMPs that the system reads in. So that all this is about is really sorting the sector so that you put it in the right industry. The investment goes to the right industry in the model. That's the idea here. So this expansion of some of these sectors is a more recent development we've done, and that's why we haven't gotten this header fixed up yet. But as we do that, what you can do for now is just look at what the choices are amongst these categories. So you can see we're not missing that much here. There's just a breakout on the on a few of these manufacturing and 2 of the service sectors that are missing from that header. Oops, at this moment. So that's the idea. You come in, sort your project. Second column. So here we're talking about the project value in millions. How much is it going to cost to build this thing? That's all this is about. So you got to, in this case, we're looking at a $75 million mine project. What are the construction dates? So we have different options here for modeling this. Whether, you know, in some cases you may have incredible detail on the investment profile for this type of stuff. Is the project going to start up in June and it's going to end next April? That kind of stuff. You can control for that by using different frequencies here. So as you can see over here in column I, we have the data frequency selection. So if you're using a 1, you're dealing with annual frequency, a 4 is quarterly frequency, and 12 for monthly frequency data. So by entering this information and setting corresponding dates that align with what frequency you're operating under, the system will then allocate that those investment dollars across your periods that you have here. Now, how that money is distributed is based on column J here. So you can see that a lot of these, there are different methods that we use here for distributing investment. Let me just pan over a little bit. So one option, and the straight line option, is a horizontal distribution. So you can plug in an H there, you'll get an even spread of that money over every period using a horizontal investment distribution. If you use the V option, you can set custom values, right? So long as those values sum to 1 and account for the number of periods. So for example, say you were doing a quarterly distribution and it was 2019 Q1 to 2019 Q4, and you wanted to use the V option, maybe you want to put that in as 10% for the first quarter, 40% for the second quarter, 40% for the third quarter, and maybe 10% again. So you just got to make sure that your values are summing to 1 so that you spend all that money and not exceeding 1. The program does have a checker built into it when you convert it into a macro, and it'll warn you of these things if your V's aren't adding up. But that's just something to keep in mind if you are doing very detailed investment distribution modeling for these projects. So you can see that we do have some pretty detailed info here on the kiosk project. That's because we work with MB Hydro and use some of their information here on that expenditure distribution. But in general, these are your choices. And then the third one is what we call a rally distribution. I don't think I have a picture of it, but if you want to visualize it, basically it's a normal distribution. Picture a normal distribution. Everybody should know what that looks like. Whereas then you can skew it forward or backward, the peak. So that's all that's doing. A lot of projects are back-end loaded, we know, from working in the construction industry. So you can use that rally if you don't really know how the money is going to be expended. If you do know something about that, about the sector, then you can definitely try to get that sort of front-end or back-end loaded normal distribution. So you're just shifting those dollars around into the latter years or latter periods or the forward periods based on what you have there. So just a couple different distribution options built into the system there already for you to select from. So next thing we have here, column D, are production dates. Now you would use this column in the event that you had an overlapping project. For example, say you were building an aluminum smelter that had 2 different production lines on it, or an LNG plant in this case, where you have a train 1 and train 2, and they're building, while they are building the whole project over 5 years, they're going to have that first train done after year 3. So this enables you to turn on part of the production before the construction period is completed. Allows that for that sort of overlap. Therefore, you'll get operational jobs starting up if you were to enter something here. Now, we don't have any projects in Manitoba's case that we're doing this for, but this becomes more of an issue when you're doing some major heavy industrial projects in this country. But the option is there. So what I could do for this mine, or let's pick another project here. It's not a very good one. We have any multi-year things we could deal with. How about this pulp and paper? Say this was a new pulp and paper mill, and say they started working by. They began the investment in 17, and then they got some of the plant working, but they're still doing some additional work to get it finished for the next 2 years. You could start that new production early is the idea, but the default setting would be that the production begins. Why can't I delete this? Somehow lost control of my spreadsheet. Oh, computer's going crazy. Okay, the default it would be, if you don't put anything in here, is that it always starts the period after the construction ends. So we have, just for reference, guys, we also have all the details of this system we include with our send off to you. So you may have noticed there's some documentation in there. I think I have it here. Yeah. So when we send you the model, this is what it looks like. You have your MN folder, and then you have a project subfolder. And in here is where we give you all the stuff. And if you go into this info folder, you can go through the data concepts in the project spreadsheet. Everything I'm describing to you now is listed in some pretty good detail in these documents. How to create the thing, simple step-by-step instructions. What are the concepts in each column? Talking about deflator code choices, productivity codes to choose from. And then, I think here we go. Is this the one that has the, let me give you the data concepts. This will give you the graph, I believe. So here's the example of the rally distribution. That's what I'm talking about. So it just allows you to skew that distribution, expenditure distribution. But at any time, if you ever need anything, you can come into these documents and just read about each one of these columns and the concepts that are in this system here. So it is all well documented. So where were we? Yeah. So the production dates, as I said, would start the period after construction is completed. So in this case, for the kiosk dam, we're using a quarterly data frequency here. So that means that 2023-1 is actually Q1. Therefore, your production is starting in the second 2023, and then you would just run that to the end of 2050. I mean, you can set this to 2090. It doesn't matter. It's the model ends at 2050, so you're just extending stuff out longer than you need to in that case. But that's the idea of how you could work with this production dates column. We then obviously try to do the best we can with naming them, whether, just stuff for our purposes, really. You want to know who the company is, the project. Sometimes the companies change or consortiums, and they change ownership all the time or sell it off to somebody else. So, but that's essentially just the list. Description, we try to give, whatever information is relevant that we've collected. Sometimes we'll put media release information, web links, things like that in these columns just to guide the user on any information about the project. And maybe the press release was talking about how much, what output was coming out of it, of course, things like that. The regional basis, this isn't so much for the Manitoba model. You can see there's nothing in it. We use this because we have sub-provincial models for Ontario, Alberta, and BC. So we like to keep track of where these things are going on an economic region basis, because we cut the province up in that way. I'm just going to shrink this column so that we can see the rest of these easier. Again, location matter, just keeping track of where the place is going. It helps with if there are similar projects with similar names, for example. If you have two sewage plants, which one are we talking about here? Which city is it going into? Again, data frequency, that distribution of investment. This one, actually, this production phase-in vector works with that production date column. So what that actually allows you to do is ramp up production. And you can see we're only doing this for the kiosk project in this case. So rather than in the second quarter of 2023, when this thing starts kicking in, starts its operations in this case, and ramping up immediately to 100% output in that quarter, here you can control for what share or which way you ramp up your production. So that happens in some of the big heavy industrial projects where they sort of test the facility for 6 months, and they only produce at maybe 25% capacity, that kind of stuff. So you can control for those type of production ramp ups. And in this case, it would be 25% in Q2, 50% in Q3 of 23, and then hitting 75% in the fourth quarter of 23. And then by the time you get into 2024, they're at 100% production capacity. So that's how you would read this. It has to work with these with your production date settings, of course. The next thing we do is we work the investment deflator year. Now you'll see that these differ. The concept here is, we use the fixed capital stocks and flows data here, and it says that. So that's actually, it shouldn't necessarily be the last year of known fixed capital stocks and flows. It depends when the project was initially announced in this case. So when you get a new project, we're trying to, deflate these investment numbers. So these are typically nominal values that you would get out of the recent press releases. We're building a new $500 million food factory, but you got to convert that into 2012 dollars, right? Because we want to convert that 500 million in today's dollars back into those real dollars that the model's trying to use. So in this case, you're using as current as information or available information on the deflator side. That what this means is the ones that have 2018 were more recently announced projects. So we're trying to, that's probably going to take that 400 million for this project and take 10% off of it in real terms, something like that, depending what the deflator is at, the construction investment deflator is at for this year relative to 2012. But typically, most of them are about 10-12%, upwards of 15%. So that's what that's about. You're trying to convert those nominal project dollars into a real figure to be more appropriate for the model, because we're working with real variables here. The next thing we have is the construction price deflator. So here you can highlight over it. So it just says choose a NAICS code from the deflator codes tab in this spreadsheet. So we provide all your choices here as well. So here we're taking as much price information as we can out of the modeling system, and using it to get proper the best representation of a deflator that you could use. So all you got to do is come in here and say, okay, look, I'm building a food plant. I want to use industry 311 as my deflator. And depending on obviously what you're building, would determine your selection here amongst these choices. So that's what we're trying to do here. And you can see all these food factories are, of course, using 311 for them. So really, we try to make it as easy as possible on you and just sort of highlight the header to guide your selection when you enter a new project. Next columns are, of course, the construction employment. So there's two concepts here. You can't use both of them at the same time. I believe the L case, what this is a labor capital ratio. So if you use the labor capital, if you know the number of construction jobs directly, these are full-time equivalent we're trying to get here. So not including part-time jobs. So you got to be careful of that sometimes when you're trying to enter these numbers. But then again, the model is using an LFS basis, which includes both full and part-time jobs in it. But to try and get that productivity estimate properly done, to get the GDP estimate done using productivity, it would be best to have full-time equivalent jobs if possible. But the point is here that you can either enter the jobs if you know them, or you can use what's called a labor capital ratio. So if we were to use a labor capital ratio of 1, in this case, times the number of the dollars in investment. So that's going to basically give you, it's going to factor in the deflator as well, but you're going to get about roughly 400 construction jobs for this project is the idea. So if I was to use a deflator of, or sorry, an LKC of 2, you're going to get about 800 jobs. So that's all this is. And the reason we put this in here is quite often you don't know either the direct operations or the direct construction jobs that are going to come with these plants or whatever you're building here. So you try to use sort of averages. And you can see that some sectors, particularly in the service industries, they'll have higher labor capital ratios just because that's they're lower productivity sectors, right? So they're different structure types, things like that. If you look at when you're constructing a building, for instance, you have to go in there and you got to finish the place. You got to put in all the electrical and the drywall and all that kind of stuff. There's a ton of jobs associated with that stuff. Whereas when you're building more of an industrial plant, you don't need it doesn't look pretty on the inside. There's going to be fewer people required to build that thing. So it's, you think of a warehouse, for example, something like that. Just a bunch of walls slapped together on some steel beams and structural supports. So that's why you tend to get differing labor capital ratios depending on the project type and industry.
So with a labor capital ratio of 1, with an investment of $408 million, you said 400 jobs, so it's 1 job per $1 million. Is that
Correct.
right? That's the
right.
coefficient? Okay.
That's right, yes. And you can see that a lot of these check out. I mean, there's the kiosk project, $8.7 billion. Apparently, there's going to be 8,900 jobs, construction jobs associated with it. So a lot of these are you're in reasonable bounds. Let's say it that way, I guess. Obviously, these vary significantly. So we're doing the best we can here to get construction employment impacts for these different project types. But you take averages. That's all there really is to it. But that is the concept, correct? You're applying that LKC times the dollars of investment. So it's jobs per million. That's the concept there. Same thing with the operational side. If you know the number of jobs, plug them in by all means. That's absolutely the best way to do it. But of course, the operations side, you tend to have significantly lower labor capital ratios. In some cases, very low. And you can also control for projects where, I think on the highway projects, for example, these tend to not bring in new operations. They're, you think of maybe a shave and pave job where they just cut the road up and then do some new paving. You're not going to add new jobs. There's no operational impact affected by that. So you tend to put very low LKO jobs or LKO ratios for those types of projects. Whereas other ones, all you're doing here is say, look, what's the LKC times 408 million? That says there's going to be about 20 operational jobs at this new sewage plant. All right, so that's the kind of stuff you're trying to consider here. That's all it's about. And given the size of some of these operational jobs, the number of these operational jobs, they don't have a major impact on your industry employment, as you can imagine. But they in some cases they can be used for the valuation purposes. So it's very difficult to get information on direct operational employment for projects. But we know them more so for projects that we've modeled in the past in more detail, things like that. So, but this is generally how you would use this column.
Some of your operations employment seem like they're high. Are they high? Or I don't know. It's just like when I look at 300 for like the operations side, is that a building of some sort? It's for the artist building.
Oh yeah. It depends because
it's so different than everything else in there.
Of course, yeah. Well, and you get retail, trade, commercial. We're trying to account for all those shops that are going to go in. and that type
Okay.
of stuff, right?
Oh.
So this is yeah, the artist building. That one we're just modeling the commercial usage of that building. But then on the True North Square, for example, it's obviously difficult to allocate the investment across industries because we're trying to do it on an FKSF basis. But it's a multi-use building, so you have 20% commercial out of the 4 towers, 53% hotel, and 27% residential. It's a blend. So you got to put, of course, the residential in the finance, insurance, and real estate sector. The hotel is going to be in your accommodation and food, and the commercial sector, we put it in administrative support type stuff because just assuming it was more professional services without going, I mean, very difficult to allocate these multi-use projects. We're never excited to model these ones, but we had to do this one for BuildForce. So
okay.
Try to get the right hits. But yeah, you're right. When you get service sector developments, you can get tons of jobs, right? Some warehouses, you think of these Amazon warehouses, $1 billion project, there's thousands and thousands of workers that come with that, and the truck drivers and the warehouse managers and staff, and it's just amazing how many jobs you can get in some industries versus other ones where they're highly automated, or particularly in the electric power sector. You can be building a $1 billion power plant, and there's 5 people working there, and 2 of them are security guards, and one guy cuts the lawn, right? So you get very incredible differences, basically, on the operational LKO type stuff. So it's hard to know, but that's what we're trying to control for in this column, in these columns, those ones. Okay. So next thing your choice is, of course, this is where I was talking about earlier, the productivity variable. You read the note there. It says choose an AICS code from the productivity codes tab, and then the format would be enter the format PR. And I put pound, where the pound is the numeric NAICS code in this case. So you can see these are all just based on the most appropriate NAICS code. So you come into the productivity codes tab, and this is where we have a lot of detail for you guys to work with. As I mentioned earlier, why we do the GDP at such a disaggregated level. So you can do, on the ag side alone, you can look at a crop versus an animal, maybe a cattle headlot versus, a marijuana facility, that kind of stuff. And again, on the mining, so you can see that there's incredible differences, right? Oil and gas has $900,000 per worker in productivity, whereas coal mining is down at 383,000. But this is where we talk about the high productivity sectors, right? And then as you get down here, very huge variances amongst manufacturing industries, and of course the service sectors. When you get down to accommodation and food, for example, very low productivity sectors, right? So you don't get a lot of GDP, but you tend to get a lot of jobs in these type of developments. So that's all we're trying to do here. And this productivity column is only used if you are using the GDP employment method in the last column here, because as I said before, you're just taking those operational jobs that you've estimated and multiplying it times productivity to get you your GDP valuation.
I have one more question, just back to the jobs and such like this. Aren't there some projects where they have to bring in workers from like other provinces?
For the construction side?
Yes.
Or even the operations side, you're right. I mean, you look at some of the mining projects, things like that, they'll have fly in, fly out.
So this would accommodate for that?
We don't directly adjust for that. Okay. What you could adjust for that by just lowering the employment.
Okay.
The operational employment estimate. That'd be the best way to do it. You're only dealing with a single province model in this case. So you just say those jobs won't show up here because the LFS is on a place of residence basis. So let's just pretend they don't exist. But if you are going to do that, you might want to actually compute the valuation yourself and plug it in. Right, okay. Because you now excluded those people.
You'd have to really know the details of that project. Like hydro
Right.
would collect that information, so you knew 50% of the trades were coming from, Saskatchewan. But for some of these projects, I assume that you wouldn't know that.
Oh yeah, very unlikely.
I was just thinking hydro, really. That's all. But yeah.
Yeah. Anyways, the options are all here. If you know everything, you can do it, right? But otherwise, we have to rely on averages for a lot of the stuff. You ask anybody, there's no other way to do it unless they know something that we don't know. So that's the best way we can really handle this stuff. Is just working with the number of jobs times the productivity in most cases. Okay, so the next column we got here is our capital output ratio. So this one, I believe, this is when you use a different method. So there's also for the GDP calculation, if I zoom over here, move over here. Other than the E method, there's a K method. We typically don't really use this one, but it's the same type of concept. You're taking average capital stock to GDP ratios, right? So if we built $1 billion worth of capital, how much GDP are you going to get out of it? So it's a less precise method, I would say, and there is less choice available, right? You can see the productivity. We have all that detail to work with for the valuation, but on the capital side, we do not. We're dealing with significantly less granularity there. So that's why, while we do enter these just so that there's something filled in for them based on the industry, we're not even using this stuff right now. But you could if you wanted to. So all that would do is take the final capital stock that is built, constructed in this, and basically the concept is that investment equals capital. So if you invest $8.7 billion, assuming that was real, first of all, you're going to get 8.7 billion in new capital stock if that 8.7 was real. So and then you would apply that KQ, or that capital output ratio, for the utilities industry, and bang, there's your GDP. It's a pretty simple method, but that option, we just put that in there as another way of doing it if you like. But as you can see, we are not using it. Next steps are, so here we get into the asset class stuff. So what we're looking at here is, I'll just highlight over it first. So again, it says use the same NAICS code from the construction price deflator reference year, column M. So we can go back and look at it. And as you can see, that these are all pretty much the same. And the reason being is because all the deflator codes that we've computed from the FKSF data are the exact same industries because we're using the FKSF data again for the machinery and equipment and building construction. And then we don't show the engineering on here, but in case you want to see it, all you would do is go 1 minus that, because mess that up. Equals 1. Technical difficulties here. So you can just see what are the big sectors for engineering. Problem with my keyboard or something. So of course, engineering is big in the public administrative industry. It's also quite big in petroleum and coal. Transportation and warehouse utilities has a big component there, and typically the mining sectors in general. You get a lot of engineering asset class allocation. That's just what they classify their investment expenditures as, because they aren't building, it's not a lot of buildings, it's outdoor work and different stuff like that. And on the utilities side, hydro dams and that type of work. So these are your, just you can look at them. They're listed here. Look at, but again, to make it simple, we just leave the rule of thumb is set it to whatever deflator code you chose, because you probably already made the right choice on the deflator. Therefore, your asset class shares by industry would be the same ones, of course, unless you want to impose these. So in some cases, we know you can hard code the numbers, as you can see here for the Line 3 project pipeline, where we know exactly how much they were spending on new pump stations, machinery and equipment, obviously, and buildings. So clearly a very small share. You can see it summing to less than 20%. And 80% of that would then, the engineering would be the residual. And that's all computed in the macro. So that will, it reads into the model, puts this type of a project is going to have a big hit on the engineering investment and not so much on the buildings, and a little bit more on the M&E. So that's all this is, dealing with the asset class for those two columns. The next one we deal with is just the depreciation rate. So after these projects are constructed, and I can show you this, we apply both a depreciation rate to the machinery and equipment share of the investment. So this is all accounted for. So we purchase our machinery and equipment for the facility. We then have to replace it every year. So the system produces sustaining investment to keep the facility active each year, that is. And then the same thing on the structures. Now, structures last significantly longer, so you get very low depreciation rate assumptions for them. So that's all we're trying to deal with here is working on the sustaining investment component. And then finally, we have the value added share aspect. So what this would do, there is another method here. How do we use the VAS here? I can't remember this. I believe it's just looking at the gross output calculation to determine GDP as well. So in this case, we're typically, you just have a selection of subsectors to choose from. And again, you put VAS and choose your most appropriate subsector that the project would apply to in this case. So for the food facilities, again, you can see they're all using a VAS FD because we have chosen the food, the first component there behind the manufacturing, within the manufacturing industry. So we keep it as simple as possible here as you go through the columns so you can make your choices. And then, of course, if you know more, you can impose all kinds of stuff here. On the export industries, this goes back to, so this is what I was talking about. This is where you control for your GDP column. What industry is this GDP going to be generated in? And of course, this is where we have all the granularity built in. This needs to be blown out as well. We have quite a few choices here. I'm not sure if we have everything in here right now. It looks like we do actually. But again, so we're going to try and get the hit on the metal mining GDP because we have 50 industries that we're working with in this model when it comes to GDP. So I think there may be 50 on the right-hand side there. We'll have to add them up. But that's, again, the concept. So it differs from the column A, where you're controlling for the 2-digit or whatever on the investment and capital stock, if you catch my drift here. So for example, within utilities, we're only interested in modeling investment and capital at the 2-digit level. Therefore, we're using the UT mnemonic. But when it comes to GDP, we want to be able to get that extra granularity there. So we're actually differentiating electric power projects from the other utility ones here. Sewage plants, for example. So that's all this is about. So you just, again, work through your stuff, make the appropriate selection, and there you go. That'll give you your GDP allocation. This is what I was talking about for that export share stuff. So typically right now, without getting into too many details, Thomas, this kind of goes back to what you were talking about. The kiosk, what are they going to do with all that power? Is it going to offset things over time? For now, we're just assuming that all that output becomes an export. So this would imply 100% of the gross output goes into exports if it's set to 1. If I was to set this to 0.5, we would have a 50% increase. The gross output would increase by 50% in the exports, and it would be cause a minus 50% in the imports. or sorry, raise imports by 50% as well, causing a negative. But again, the net impact is the same on the actual on the economy. What is going on here?
So just go back to that, the IO versus this model. There's sort of pros and cons to both. Like I'm thinking, I mean, if you're looking at adding a particular project, say that the government's considering, it would have to be fairly significant to even make a dent here on the macro side. Whereas I guess with the IO is that you can actually look at measuring things more directly, right, from that project or that, like, what I'm trying to think about how we could apply this in terms of some of the work that may come our way where we want to input or modify this. But
yes, yeah.
I'm just thinking this is more like the cumulative impacts here are going to have a pretty substantial impact going forward with the economy. But one particular project like kiosk and those generated utilities those are billions and billions of dollars, right? So you can see what kind of impact it's going to have on it. But what is and then to go back to this too, is it anything that's over a certain threshold that major projects are, like, that's how you define these?
You can do whatever you like. We try to look for the larger projects in general because they tend to move the needle. Of course, more, like I said, the model is already trying to generate some investment on the base investment based on expected sales growth, right? So this is where your investment tuning is the art. That's as we always say, because of this for that reason. So whether the pulp and paper sector is going to pick up, or in this case it's a sustaining capital increase, but the model is going to generate some industrial expansion on its own. It's your sort of job as a forecaster to try and separate that from base sector demands, right? So ideally, when we first constructed this system, was to get only the biggest projects, the hundreds of millions. In some provinces, I think our minimum was about $250 million, things like that. But we have made some concessions and put in some of the lower stuff as well. But you may notice when we work on our investment tuning, a lot of these we offset with those ZI adjustments. We don't believe there's going to be an absolute first difference in the project change on the sector as a whole. But in the case of the biggest projects, you can start to see what it was actually at relative to historically, relative to the fixed capital stocks and flows data, right? I mean, kiosk is a very special situation. Let me get out here a bit. So that thing started back in 2012, for instance. Now I'll have to look at what the ITs were in those years, but most of this ramp up that has occurred, I mean, kiosk is included in here all the way up to 2018. So that's what I was talking about, how you have to work on that transition stuff here when you go from history to known to forecast year. So it's a bit of a mess, Mike, but it's really up to the modeler to try and figure out exactly how to use these projects. So that's why you get a lot of, with the bigger and the longer projects, the ones that go further out into the future, I mean, you basically have to tune for every year that project exists. I would just say it that way.
Okay, well, that sounds good.
Okay, so if you made your simple assumption about export shares, if you want to make any changes on that, then you can, but production on and off. So here, basically all we do here is we say there's no GDP. This allows you to just shut off GDP, shut off capital. The idea here is so that you can put in projects that are just going to lift investment temporarily, right? So in this case, we're just talking about maybe repairing roads and things like that. they're not expected to increase the capital stock or generate new GDP after they're done. These are really just sort of one-off investment lifts to the economy. So you can just shut off production in this case. So if you read this, I can actually see it all. We just put a note in there. It says there will be no operations, employment, GDP, exports, imports, and no sustaining investment generated if you say no to production in this case. But the default is yes. So that option is in there as well. So just a quick way of not creating GDP and all kinds of spin-off work, direct spin-off work after the fact. And then finally, our GDP calculation method. So you can use the E method, which multiplies the times productivity. The K method that uses the capital output ratio, which I don't really recommend, but is there. And then a number value where you set it to that number. I actually should fix that note because you need to have a dollar sign in there to tell the program that you're putting in. That'll be in millions of dollars, whatever your valuation estimates are for the GDP from that facility. So that's the gist of it. After you've put all these projects in, your next step is to come into this major project system. So let me just make a copy of my projects so I don't destroy the whole thing. So all I'm going to do, I'm just moving the forecast gear into that project subfolder for the model that I send you guys. It will be in the Manitoba folder, so you'll have that path. Maybe not the prop mods, but that should be the structure generally. The next thing I need to do, I actually have to close this version and open the new one. So when we send you this projects folder, you'll have the Visual Basic program in there as well. You can just open that guy up. Pops it up, say hit list workbooks. So it will detect that you have the project spreadsheet open. I have a bunch of other ones, but all you do is select the one. If you wanted to, for example, if you had numerous project spreadsheets, you could do them all at once. But in this case, we're not going to do that. We're just going to do this one. So we just hit create selected. So this is where you get some warning messages. It just makes sure that you didn't do anything crazy in here. So we get some, we put some maximums and minimums on certain things. For example, the labor capital ratio. So it's just saying, watch out. You entered in cell P21, a pretty high LKO. So just make sure you didn't mess that up. And then here, your LKC was in cell O23 is 364. Are you sure about that? That kind of stuff. And then it'll tell you finished when it's done. So what we now have in the project subfolder, I should have pretty much a brand new MN Proj 202 macro. And if we go look in here, this thing's a bit of a mess. So I'll just go through one project with you to show you what the code that's developed for this thing. You can read about this in the document if you're interested. So here we just initialize every project variable right off the bat here, setting everything to 0. We've set the frequency to 1 in this case, so we're using an annual frequency. We then go down here, and this is where we start pulling in all the information. We're using those machinery and equipment shares, the building construction share of investment. So this builds out your, I believe this is your deflator. So it's a bit complicated, and then it works on your deflator years that you chose to deflate the project value. Call that the temp PP. The productivity value. So again, we selected industry 21-22, and we're using the productivity in 2015 in this case, which they're all fixed. That is, doesn't matter. And then the capital output ratio. So basically everything you've entered in those columns is then read in here. These are your depreciation rates on M&E and on their structures. and your export share that you selected. So these all get set. And then we go in here. So in this case, the project is $75 million distributed by those PPs that or deflated by that PP that we've set up here. LKC ratio, so here again, same concept. You're just taking the jobs and you're distributing them over that investment period. Labor capital ratio for operations. We then have the standard distribution on investment. So here it's a 1-year project from 2019 to 2019. So pretty simple project in this case. And also the production period. So this is that the production phase and vector piece that I mentioned. In this case, we're not assuming that it ramps up in any way. So all this says is after the investment is done in 2019, you hit 100% production on your GDP and gross output from 2020 and on. We then enter the construction phase. So here we're estimating those IT variables, the total investment, we call it. So it just takes that value, that deflated value that was estimated, times your investment distribution. We then have the construction component. So here we're just taking 1 minus the machinery and equipment share, distributing that investment again over the periods and multiplying it times the project value. So you get your construction investment. Then we look at the building construction, the engineering piece together as well, or separately. I mean, looking at construction employment, so then same type of stuff. Here you're working with the LKC in this case. Had you entered the jobs directly, it would have just imposed them on the right-hand side here. And then we increment that capital stock. We add it all up, and here's your cumulative capital stock that I talked about, just in case there is a multi-year phase in on that capital. In this case, production is turned off apparently. And then you have your operations employment. So we set them to EO. These should have been developed up ahead. Oh yeah, we did plug these in directly. The construction employment, and every project gets numbered in this system. So here we're dealing with the OOP project number 1, and then obviously more detail on the GDP like I was showing you. So here we're dealing with the metallic mineral mining GDP, and the same thing for the exports and the imports, because we have that disaggregation in the modeling system. And then it's all over after this. And all we do is we delete all those variables, and then we start over on the next project. Reinitialize everything to 0, and then you just go through the same process. So that's what the code does. This is obviously the kiosk project because, yeah, you can see the titles at the top here. And you can see that detailed investment distribution on that money being spent over that very long period. So I hope that it's a mess. You can read it. You can sit there and plug all the numbers in and do the calculations if you like, but it's all in here, and that's essentially what the program does. It just converts all your assumptions you put into this spreadsheet, and then pumps them out into a macro, which you can then run. I'll do that now. So here we are in the projects folder. I believe we include a BAM file in here. So I'm just going to check what's in it, show you what's in it. So what it will do is run this header. It'll then run the project macro that we just created. It'll then copy that database up 1 folder from that project subfolder into the model folder. So I'll just go through these quickly. The header macro, all this does is this is where you get all those capital output ratios, value added shares that are being used in the system, and then initializes every single one of the project variables that's read into the macro model. And that's about it. It's pretty simple, but it is responsible for setting up a lot of this information that is required for the next macro to run. and it gets that information from your Manitoba model history base. So as you can see, the path here is a ... meaning it's looking for that HBase MN202 up one folder from this location. So that's how you read that. So it's basically, it's going into your history base up one folder, going in here, grabbing your history base, extracting that information out of it, anything down here that's being read from it, and then we run that project macro next. So after the headers run, you're running that project macro, and then finally we will run this copy base macro, and all that does, you get your version code here. So it just takes that project database.esd, all databases have an ESD file extension, and then it just moves it up one folder. So the idea is we're just trying to make it as easy as possible on you. So all you guys have to do after you've created the new project macro, you can just run the BAM file. So it's running so fast you can't even see the lines. There you go, it's done. So that will have put a new project database created right now. You can check your date modified there. You should do that, make sure it's working. I recommend that. So you have a new project database. So that's it. That's how the system's set up. At this point, you can then change your working folder back into your model folder, get rid of the projects there. And you're now ready to run your solution batch file. So I'm not sure who has actually run the model yet, but this is the ASOL BAM, we call it. And I showed you this a bit yesterday. We have a bunch of versions of these in case you want to run it different ways. We also have a shock version, which we'll look at next. And all that was in this batch file. Again, was the adds macro and the 6 macros I showed you, EX1 to 6. And then finally, we run that ASOL macro. And I'll look at that quickly.
I have a question. Sorry.
Yes.
Are we supposed to be taking a break right now? Is that part of the agenda? Like, do we want to work through a couple more things before we break for lunch, or? No,
that's fine. Why don't we take lunch? Sorry, I wasn't watching the clock.
No, I wasn't sure in terms of the agenda times here.
Right. Yeah, noon was supposed to be our lunch break. So.
Okay. I mean,
you guys got to stop me. I just keep going.
Yeah.
We get sidetracked, a lot of conversations. So. Okay, no, that's it. I mean, I think unless you guys have any questions about the project macro before we break, we're just going to run the system now at this point and show you some general tuning stuff, and then we can this afternoon you can work on any of the custom stuff you guys want to look at.
Okay.
Okay.
No, it was good. Yeah.
Any questions?
Yeah, I have a question before we break for lunch. So from the major projects list, when you were using, I believe it was the productivity accounts to estimate the GDP from the operations of each of the projects. Is that correct?
You're wondering where do we get these estimates of productivity from?
No, not that. My question is, if there is an investment in an industry that is not pre-existing in Manitoba, then what do you do?
What do you do? Right.
Oh,
Figure out where that industry is going to be classified, for one. What industry?
You look at other provinces?
Do you have in mind? Maybe
cannabis, or?
Well, I don't know. It could be any industry, but like, would you just look at the productivity in other jurisdictions, other provinces, just as a reference case?
We haven't had anything come up, unless you have some specific examples. You know, I mean, cannabis is in your crop production, the grow houses, that is. So not a problem for that one when that industry sort of took off into the non-black market side of things. But no, I mean, we haven't had to model a project in a new industry per se. You know, I think most of the selections we have the choices we have for industries, most, I think, new sectors would eventually get classified within them. You know, on the mining side, for example, we have other primary things like that. We have other manufacturing. So if you're talking about goods producing sectors within other primary or manufacturing, you could definitely put it in there.
I don't mean it would be a new NAICS code, like a new industry, in the sense that you need to establish a new NAICS code for it. Like this is an industry that exists in Canada, but we just simply don't have any facilities in that industry within Manitoba.
Right. Yeah, you definitely you could look at national settings and that kind of stuff.
Okay.
Or look any other province where you know it's pre-existing. You can look at the productivity from there. You can, and if we don't have it, if it's new to the country, go look at the U.S. something like that. You definitely get productivity measures out of them. There's typically studies. In that case, you could try and find something on the internet or anywhere in the research. So yeah, you typically, if it's new to the world, that's another issue, of course. But typically, yes, you could just go into international sources to try and get some measures to help you drive this stuff.
Okay, so I guess we'll break for lunch. I do have to leave the meeting here. My video is kind of skipping on Teams, so I think I have to turn off my computer and reboot it here.
Okay. No problem. Okay, guys. How about we'll see you in an hour? Does that work?
Sounds good.
Sounds good.
Okay.